So I'm back from COP27 and I will be completely honest with you, it chewed me up and spat me out, and to be honest I feel like a shell of a human being, but I really want to show you what it was actually like to be there, partly because I promised and partly because I think it's also quite important to show you what it's really like. I feel really disheartened by the whole thing, but one of the silver linings of the whole experience was meeting loads and loads of really cool people, including Robbie, who you're going to meet later. But firstly, what the hell's a COP? So a COP is a conference of the parties, and it's a big F-off meeting of all the world's governments to discuss how to respond to the climate crisis within the kind of UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, or the UNFCCC. It's basically a massive international meeting where government delegates talk about climate action, or rather the lack thereof. But away from the negotiations themselves, there is a proliferation of pavilions dedicated to different causes or nations. And that's where side events are happening, with talks and workshops and panel discussions and a bunch of other different stuff. And that's actually why I was there, to help out at the Cryosphere Pavilion. We're here at COP at the Cryosphere Pavilion. Let's check it out. Here we're talking about all things icy and frozen, from ice sheets to polar oceans, permafrost, sea ice and mountain glaciers and snow. We've had a whole bunch of different events on this week, all talking about various elements of the cryosphere and how climate change is impacting them. I mean, having not been here before, it's quite hard to compare to previous COPs, but it does seem like there is a lot of side events going on, like a lot of pavilions. It's very hectic, very overwhelming, quite confusing, and I feel like you could spend your entire COP at the side events and not see any of the negotiations and think that was the whole of COP and that would be more than enough. It felt really important to be there, you know, being part of the conversation about climate change, climate action, and bringing the polar regions to the fore in those discussions. And I am really glad there was a bunch of us there to do exactly that.
I am Robbie Mallet, and I have just defended but not finished a PhD in sea ice science. So we're here at the Cryosphere Pavilion, where I tell people about that, Arctic sea ice. So I'm here to just speak about Arctic sea ice, what's happening, what's not happening, and frame a lot of discussions about the Arctic, because there's some really important stuff going on with like shipping, black carbon, respecting indigenous people's rights, and a lot of that actually touches on sea ice. So I'm here to just give a sea ice science specific perspective, often at the beginning or the end of some of the sessions.
It might seem like the polar regions are almost as far away as you can get from el-sheikh in Egypt, but they're actually closer than you might think. So the Cryosphere does not have its own delegation. It doesn't have a delegation to advocate for it. So it's really crucial that people like us, like scientists, policymakers, advocates, can be here to present the argument that we should be protecting the cryosphere, because the cryosphere affects us all, right? It's the polar regions. What happens in the polar regions doesn't stay in the polar regions. You know, we get melting in Antarctica, melting in Greenland, melting in mountain glaciers, and that doesn't just stay there. It causes sea level rise. It has impacts on our drinking water resources, on agriculture, on all of these things that have real tangible impacts on people's lives, on their livelihoods, and has real profound impacts across the world, and will continue to do so for many years to come. Two of the main foci of this year's negotiations were water resources and loss and damage. And loss and damage is a way of describing the inevitable changes that are going to have to be compensated for as a result of climate change. And climate change in the polar regions has profound impacts on both water resources and loss and damage. For instance, take glaciers in the Himalayas, which indirectly supply nearly 2 billion people downstream with drinking water and support agriculture across Asia by providing water for irrigation. And mountain glaciers are currently contributing more to sea level rise than either ice sheet in Greenland or Antarctica. But the Greenland and Antarctic ice sheets contain coastline changing amounts of sea level rise. Plus, with ice sheets, there's always the potential for devastating non-linear change. You know, the collapse of the West Antarctic ice sheet, for instance, which would be really hard to predict and which will be really hard to adapt to because it will be so sudden. You know, 3.5 meters of sea level rise will be catastrophic, and that becomes more and more likely with every increment of warming. For many parts of the cryosphere, warming of more than 1.5 degrees Celsius would spell irreversible change. We've already committed to some changes, that's a given, including things like the loss of 1/3 of the tropical glaciers in UNESCO heritage sites. Arctic summer sea ice loss is now essentially inevitable because the Arctic is warming so fast, at 3 or even 4 times the global average. But there are still so many changes that we can avoid by limiting warming to the lowest levels. Essentially, permanent loss and damage in the polar regions can only be avoided by the lowest emissions. Scenarios where emissions and temperatures peak at 1.6 degrees and decline to net zero by 2050. The science is clear on the importance of 1.5 degrees for avoiding the worst consequences of climate change. But is anyone actually listening to the science? Now, others may feel differently about this, but personally I found it really hard to feel like I was having any impact at all as a scientist at COP, because the people who really need to hear the science aren't the people who are stopping by and coming to talk to us. We really need to speak truth to power, not just talk to people who are already sympathetic to polar science or climate science for that matter. We need presidents and prime ministers and environment ministers to hear this and to act on it. And ultimately, I didn't feel like I was able to talk to the right people at the right time this COP.
We have to have COP, and if we didn't have it, we'd have to invent it. So it's good that we're all here, and it's good that world leaders are getting their heads together, but there also seem to be like a lot of people who are maybe just more here for the selfies than for for facilitating meaningful change. Well, everyone was really hopeful and stuff really happened and there were all these big pledges, and then it seems to just be sort of the same again, which implies that it's, to me, that it's always the same and we're maybe not getting anywhere.
I'm so jaded about COP. I think it's really important to get everyone in the same room, around the same table, to talk about these issues, even though the progress is so slow. It's frustratingly slow, it's far too slow, it's not addressing the crisis anywhere near as urgently as it needs to. It's still a really important process to go through because international negotiation is a really important part of how we tackle an international crisis. Obviously, it's only one part of the solutions to climate change, but I think it is a really big and important one. So, there we go. I couldn't have said it better myself. Anyway, let me know what you think in the comments. I'm really interested to hear your thoughts, and make sure you subscribe if you're new around here. Anyway, till next time.